Hi, welcome back. It's Steve Smith here again, and after the last presentation, which was an introduction to some issues to do with reading, this one's a bit more practical, and it's about teaching with written texts. So with no further ado, let's get on. Firstly, the written text, it is the resource par excellence, I think, whatever the level, whether it's with beginners, intermediates, or advanced level students. Using text has so much going for it. Why? Well, they're a source of reading, they can be a source of grammatical structures, vocabulary, listening work, speaking. It's the starting point for all sorts of intensive input-output practice, often with some great cultural content as well. The text exploits the visual dimension because you're reading rather than just listening. It's a great source of cultural information and the basis, therefore, of a multi-skill lesson, which can often be conducted entirely or nearly always in the target language. Of course, texts these days are so easy to find or adapt from online sources, and of course they're easy to write yourself. I've got to say for myself, whenever I found a good text in a textbook or a good text that I'd found or adapted myself, to me it felt a very comfortable place to be as a language teacher. I knew that I could apply a repertoire of different tasks and have a lesson pretty much planned. So the resource for the lesson was the text, and then once you knew what to do with it, then so much could follow naturally. So first of all, now, which sort of texts should we be using? Well, as I mentioned in the last presentation, there's always the question about whether they should be authentic or not, and I made the case then for texts not necessarily being authentic, but ideally being comprehensible, and ideally 95 to 98% comprehensible, according to Nation and Newton. So texts that are too hard or off-putting, but also they can't be processed, and therefore they're not ideal for language acquisition. That's not to say that sometimes there won't be texts which are tougher, which have to be done for the syllabus or because they're interesting and take a lot more scaffolding, but as a general rule, especially with younger learners, try and keep it comprehensible. I mean, texts which are too easy may well be a good source for other activities, and they may allow you to recycle existing known language, but perhaps they won't do too much to improve students' reading skills. So ideally, you're producing texts that are at or maybe just above the level of the students. Texts which aren't too long. What can happen is that you end up with such a long text that you can spend a whole lesson simply decoding the text, deciphering it, that you can't get on to doing activities based around the text. So on the whole, I think shorter texts are great, which can then be intensively exploited in all sorts of ways. Texts which relate to students' own experience can be great, because students may be more comfortable talking about their own lives and matters that are relevant to them. But, don't discount other texts. I mean, you can do texts on topics that are relevant to the syllabus or that are relevant to everyday lives, and so-called worthy, important topics to do with issues, whether it be diversity, racism, the environment, you name it. I think you can say that we have as teachers a bit of a wider duty to educate our students into topics that they don't know so much about already, as well as appealing to their own interests as they exist. Of course, it's really hard to know what will interest every individual student. I often spend time thinking about what texts can I find and adapt that would be of interest, and it's really hard to know what every individual student would be interested in. So, which text is an important issue even before you decide what to do with them? I'd add as well something else. Some texts, when you look at them, might appear to be superficially interesting, but when you think about how they might be exploited, they can provide more of a challenge. So, for example, narrative texts can often be a superb opportunity to introduce more creative language activities, whereas fact-based texts may be more challenging in that regard. People often talk about pre-reading tasks when working on texts, and certainly on the whole I think they're to be recommended, just to prepare the ground, as it were. You might want to ask a few questions about the topic or give a brief introduction to the topic of the text. You might want to get students to guess what sort of areas might be covered in the text. Anything which might arouse some interest in or provide some knowledge, so that the students' appetites are whetted a little bit about the text before they begin. That may be of more relevance for intermediate and advanced learners, but even younger learners, a little bit of vocabulary brainstorming, for example, could be useful, or even finding out what they know in their own language about the text, just to get them ready for what's to follow. So research certainly supports the idea of activating pre-existing knowledge to spark interest and memory. In fact, there's even research from cognitive psychology that suggests that even if you get students to make guesses, total guesses about what might be in the text or what they're going to learn, that in the end can improve memory recall later on. So here's some specific ideas. I'll let you scan through those. You can always pause these presentations, by the way, if you want to write down any notes, and you might have your own ideas which you could add to those on the screen. So what do you do to start with the text? Well, there's all sorts of things you could do, but my own inclination was not to do silent reading. The main reason for that was that it struck me that with silent reading you can never be certain what the students are thinking about and whether they're taking the task seriously. So my feeling was not to allow silent reading first. So I would always go for reading aloud or playing a recording of the text so that students get to hear the correct pronunciation. Remember what we said in terms of reading, that there's a relationship between listening, pronunciation and the reading skill. If you read at the right pace, then this encourages them to read slowly and carefully, to process the text carefully, discourages skim reading. It's also quite a good settling activity for a class. But you want to make sure that they are actually following the text, and there are ways of doing that. Younger learners could follow with their finger or by using a ruler. You could warn them that you're going to stop at any moment, and students have to say where. So the little tricks of the trade that you can use apart from your general teacher skill of looking up and watching and observing students' behaviour. With younger or lower proficiency groups, I would certainly recommend some choral reading aloud. Often this can fix some pronunciation issues, it builds their phonics skill. It's also quite an unthreatening thing for students to do, choral reading aloud. But if you're going to do it, make sure you do it well. Do it rigorously. So if you can tell that students aren't really fully participating, or if they're being lazy with their pronunciation, you need to fix that early on and make sure that whenever you do choral reading aloud that it's being done really well. And if necessary, explain to the students why you're doing it. Explain that if they can pronounce well, it will help them both with their listening and with their reading. Individual reading aloud, well, students are often happy to do this so long as the text is not too difficult, but make sure that they've done good amounts of choral reading aloud first, and that if they're going to do it, they're going to experience mastery. It's a good chance to monitor students' accent and intonation. It's also known from cognitive psychology that students who read aloud are better able to talk about what they've read afterwards. It's called the production effect. So speaking aloud, you often find that those students will remember what they've read better. I certainly found that myself as a teacher. If I asked comprehension questions after some reading aloud, often the first hand up was from the person who'd read aloud. The only time that might not occur would be, for example, if the students had real difficulties reading aloud, and then their attention might be so wound up with the reading aloud, the actual decoding, that they can't focus on the comprehension. So that's just a reminder, if you do reading aloud, make sure that the process has been well scaffolded in advance and that the students can do it well, and then you don't get those issues of embarrassment and very poor pronunciation. When reading aloud, I would avoid chunks of language which are too long. So, with younger learners, maybe just a sentence each is enough, or a very short paragraph. And even with advanced learners, you might limit the amount that each person reads aloud to keep everyone busy. If you think the students are ready, of course, they can then do paired reading. And a nice little trick which I've observed work is that idea of reading aloud individually, but with your fingers in your ears, so then you hear your own voice, but you're not distracted by other people, and other people aren't having to listen to you. So a nice little trick there. Reading aloud also allows you to focus on intonation, pitch and stress. So in French, for example, you can practice the rising intonation that you get at the end of words and groups of words, that slight extra stress and pitch rise that often comes at the ends of phrases. And of course, awareness of intonation helps students break down the sound stream. They can use intonation to help them find out where the meaningful word groups are. And if you do this, I'd suggest that you actually exaggerate intonation patterns and get them to have fun doing the same. If you can do skimming and scanning, well, certainly it's a skill to be learned. It's not something that I would particularly choose to stress myself, but you can certainly include that in the diet, I would suggest, particularly with intermediate, older learners, where there might be text with facts and figures, where they can pick out some key facts. But, I would avoid skimming and scanning replacing what can be called thorough processing of the text, working on it intensively. I think that will give you more gains in terms of acquisition. So next, I'm going to follow with pretty quickly a run through of various tasks, some of which you may do already, some which may be new to you. So Jigsaw reading is a classic, usually for intermediate and above, and you cut and paste paragraphs, and you get them in the wrong order, and students have to put them in the right order. So it doesn't work with every sort of text, but where there's a clear development from one point to the next and clear links from paragraph to paragraph, that's quite a fun thing to do individually or in pairs. Filling in tables is quite a common practice with reading. Headlines or summaries, so matching a headline to a paragraph. This shows a grasp of meaning and structure when students have to match short summaries to headlines. You could include distractors, so headlines which don't match to any of the texts. Similar activity is matching your own summaries with the paragraphs. So these could be summaries in the first language, probably would be actually. You could design summaries in the second language that match with the original paragraphs. The classic sort of find the French, find the German, find the Spanish. A pretty good early task to do with a text which gets them rereading and spotting chunks and individual words. Could be done orally. If you choose to do this as a whole class writing task, then you know that everyone is doing the task. If you do it led from the front with hands up, you can't be certain that everyone is fully engaged in the task. So you might, for example, get students to find the French, give them a time limit, say 10 seconds, 20 seconds, then ask them whether they found it. It's a good lesson starter, by the way, a good do now activity. Getting students to do glossaries, complete glossaries that you've designed. And you can scaffold these, depending on the class. So, for example, giving the first letters of the words they have to identify from the text. Asking students for synonyms and antonyms of words in the text. This encourages deep processing of vocabulary. Or you could give a synonym and students have to find the word in the text. That's a little easier, of course. You could do this orally or in writing. A good way for less confident students to get into a written text is to get them simply to highlight, to underline any cognates. And it's a reminder to them of the useful strategy of using cognates to make meaning from the text. They may not do this naturally. Probably your more able students do. It's interesting that the research on metacognition suggests that the best students at using strategies are the ones who tend to be very good anyway at language learning. So if they're not so able, then a bit more help is needed, guiding them towards strategies such as cognate searches. The classic question-answer sort of routines that I've spoken about previously, so I won't go into those in detail now. But, you know, the full range of questioning styles can be used. I mentioned some there. And then you can move from oral questions to written answers. And of course, asking questions provides lots and lots of good listening practice as well, which you can tune to your particular group. So the classic question-answer on a text is still, you know, I think a crucial tool for you as a language teacher. And of course the variations on question-answer style drills. So students might have to make up questions of their own. Or you could give an answer and students make up the question. Or you can give false statements for students to correct from the text. Students can do the same in pairs. Student A makes up a false statement, student B corrects. Once you get to a sort of low intermediate level and beyond, you can go a bit beyond question-answer work, asking students to define the meaning of words or phrases. Alternatively, you could provide a definition and students have to find the word or phrase in the target language. Lots of listening going on there, lots of relating, listening to reading as well. If you ask questions in English in the first language, it does have the disadvantage of moving away from the target language, but don't ignore it because it does focus on meaning, and with harder texts it can be a way of getting into the text. If you ask a question in English, often what's in the question helps with the understanding of the text itself. And if you're assessing reading, of course, questions in English don't muddy the waters. So you're unable to test discreetly, individually, the skill of reading. Whereas if you ask questions in the target language, which have to be answered in the target language, you're then also assessing writing at the same time. So you can see it doesn't allow you to assess reading. And questions can be differentiated. Some questions can even invite translation of whole sentences or paragraphs. So they can demand quite careful processing of texts. Classic true, false, not mentioned is good for comprehension, but if you design these yourself, be very, very careful. The difference between not mentioned and false can be problematic, and what might seem obvious to you might not seem obvious to the student. The reason that true, false, and not mentioned is often given in exams is, of course, that you need 3 options for an assessment to be valid and reliable. True, false means that there's a 50-50 guess, and that's not reliable for assessment purposes. Students can make these up themselves, of course. True, false, and not mentioned. That's a fun challenge for able students. Matching tasks, that usually takes the form of starts and ends of sentences which students have to match up to show they've got the meaning. You can do this with questions and answers, matching questions to answers as well. Completing sentences, a useful task once you've worked on the text for a while. So you give them a start of a sentence. They have to complete it. You could do it orally or in writing. Then you've got the option of multi-choice. 3 options is fine. Classic gap fill, where you blank out words, phrases, or even whole sentences from the original text. Gaps can be done in all sorts of ways, and you can scaffold the gaps by giving the first letter or syllable, by choosing on something to gap, such as verb forms. If you go to my blog at FrenchTeacherNet.blogspot, I did a particular blog on gap fills. If you just search gap fills, you'll get an idea of the full range of tasks that you can use involving gapping. So, I hope that gave you just a glimpse of the range of different things you can do with a text. And perhaps you have some of your own additions that you would suggest as well, and feel free to leave comments on the page on the YouTube channel. For some further reading, I'd suggest Nation and Newton. And this particular presentation I put together essentially based on a page from FrenchTeacher.net. That's within the Teacher's Guide pages, where I have a section on teaching with texts. Thank you very much for listening to that, and I hope you'll come back and listen to some more of my presentations. Bye for now.